They all said he was finished. After last season's collapse, when the wash plant broke down, the pay dirt dried up, and the crew walked away, Fred Lewis had become the poster boy for failure. The headlines were brutal, the fans even worse. Debt collectors called. Discovery stopped returning emails. Everyone expected him to vanish quietly into the Alaskan snow and never come back. But Fred didn't vanish. He disappeared with purpose. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear changes everything you thought you knew about Fred Lewis. For almost 6 months, nobody saw him. Not a single photo, not a single rumor of a new claim. Until one morning, a long-haul driver spotted a familiar face at a Yukon fuel stop. Fred, bearded, alone, driving a beat-up military truck with a trailer full of mining gear. No convoy, no crew, just one old partner from his Army days. When the story hit the Dawson channels, most people laughed it off. Fred Lewis, mining solo? He's done. But within weeks, whispers started to spread that Fred had stumbled onto something. Something even Parker Schnabel had walked away from years ago, a forgotten claim buried deep in the backcountry. By the time the other miners caught wind, it was already too late. Fred was in, and he wasn't talking. The Yukon chatter turned from mockery to curiosity. If Fred was out there working without cameras, without a team, and without backing, then maybe, just maybe, he'd found something no one else was supposed to. The truth came out later, by accident, when a close friend mentioned an old military storage container Fred had been cleaning out that spring. Among the usual boxes of service medals and field manuals, he found a sealed file marked Restricted Project Patriot. Inside was a folded map covered in faded grid lines, and in the margins, a series of coordinates written in code. At first, he thought it was nothing, just another Cold War-era logistics sheet. But when he plugged the numbers into his GPS, they pointed to a frozen corridor north of the Tintina Trench, labeled in red ink, Patriot Site 03, 1983. The deeper he looked, the stranger it got. The report mentioned unrecovered assets and temporary burial zones during resupply withdrawal. Military slang, but Fred recognized it instantly. Unrecovered assets meant something was left behind, something valuable. Maybe not gold, maybe not at first glance, but enough to make men bury it under ice and walk away. And as Fred pieced it together, a theory began to form. Those assets weren't weapons. They were unregistered bullion, moved during the Cold War under a classified fund. Never logged, never claimed. That was the moment the old soldier woke up inside him. Fred loaded the truck, packed rations for a month, and drove into the corridor with nothing but satellite imagery, an old field compass, and his gut. What he found changed everything. The terrain was brutal. Ice cracks, avalanches, constant whiteout. But halfway through his second week, his ground-penetrating scanner hit something dense under the snowpack. When he dug it out, he saw squared timber beams buried deep, aligned perfectly. Not natural formations. Someone had built there, long before any modern operation. He brushed away more snow and found what looked like a drift mine sealed with frozen debris. It had been hidden for decades, untouched since the early 1900s. Inside, the air was still, dry, almost sterile. And on the walls, markings, U.S. military tags from the 1950s hammered into the supports, and below them, old miner signatures burned into wood. It was as if two different eras had collided in one tunnel. Fred gathered a small sample from the chamber floor, black sand, flecked with metallic glints, and mailed it to a private lab under an alias. 3 days later, the call came. The assay numbers were off the charts, beyond any standard Yukon placer reading. Whatever was buried under that ice corridor wasn't just a forgotten mine. It was a vault, and Fred Lewis had just found the key. He didn't tell anyone, not even the few miners who still trusted him. He knew what this was now. The tags on the walls weren't random. They were a breadcrumb trail, left by men who'd buried something they were never supposed to. If the assay was right, this wasn't about gold dust or nuggets. It was about bullion. And that meant government hands, old operations, classified silence. Fred understood what would happen the moment word got out. Lawyers, agencies, discovery itself swarming over his claim. So he went dark. No calls, no permits, just a plan. Fred didn't call miners. He called soldiers. 4 men, each one handpicked, each one with a past tied to his own. A demolitions expert, a logistics sergeant, a combat engineer, and a medic. Every one of them had seen things they were never allowed to talk about. And every one of them owed Fred their life from Afghanistan. They didn't ask for details, they just showed up. They met quietly on the outskirts of Dawson, long after the crews had turned in for the night. No gear haulers, no press, no permits. They worked in silence, building a makeshift camp out of scavenged containers and blackout tarps. It wasn't a gold mine. It looked more like a covert operation. Fred funded it himself, paying in gold dust scraped from old Yukon tailings. No paper trail, no banking transfers. Just physical gold, handed out by weight. Every man signed a non-disclosure agreement written by Fred himself, sealed with a thumbprint instead of a signature. He didn't trust lawyers, and he didn't trust discovery. This was their mission, and no one else would ever know. By the 3rd week, they had fuel drums buried, satellite uplinks disabled, and sensors rigged around the perimeter. They ran their generators at night only, masking heat under insulated tarp to avoid detection from above. Fred worked 16-hour days, digging test cuts into the glacial shelf, while the others reinforced the camp. What started as a rumor became a full-scale operation under the radar. Then one afternoon, as the wash plant rattled to life for the first time, the sluice box caught a flash. Gold, real, bright, heavy. The first ounce pulled from that frozen corridor. They didn't celebrate. They just weighed it, bagged it, and buried it again. No cameras, no bragging, off the books entirely. But secrets in the Yukon never stay buried for long. A prospector 2 valleys over, testing new imaging software, noticed something odd on a satellite overlay. Heat signatures, steady and rectangular, right where the glacier should have been solid ice. He uploaded the image to a mining forum, asking if it was volcanic activity. Within hours, users traced the coordinates and realized they matched Fred Lewis's rumored claim area. By morning, word spread through Dawson like wildfire. Fred was mining illegally on restricted land. News crews tried to reach him. Park authorities called. Even the network tried to get a comment. Fred didn't say a word. He shut down his comms, killed his GPS, and went completely dark. Not a peep for 14 days. Then, as quietly as he'd vanished, new footage surfaced online. An aerial clip shot from a government helicopter showing a freshly cut road carved straight into the glacier's core. The vehicle tracks matched military-grade tires. Whoever was working there wasn't hiding anymore. They were digging deeper. Down below that corridor, Fred and his team had found something they hadn't expected. Metal. Not gold, but solid steel plates buried under meters of permafrost. When they finally broke through, they uncovered an entrance reinforced with rusted double doors. Military issue, at least 70 years old. The stenciling was almost gone, but faint letters still showed through the rust. Property of U.S. Geological Survey, Anchorage Depot. Inside, the air reeked of oil and dynamite residue. They swept the first tunnel and found crates stacked in the dark rotted wood labeled U.S. Geological Survey, 1954. The boxes were full of blasting caps, survey rods, and broken instruments, proof this wasn't just an ordinary mine. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. Every corridor was braced with uniform steel beams, built too precisely for frontier miners. Then they found it, a massive chamber wrapped in lead sheeting, sealed tight, as if designed to block radio waves. No gold yet. But something about that chamber made the whole crew go silent. Fred's flashlight beam followed the walls until it hit a shape in the ice. Partially collapsed, crushed under decades of pressure. When the frost finally cleared, letters emerged through the grime. BR9. Bravo 9. None of them spoke. The marking wasn't civilian, it was military classification, the kind used for Cold War storage sites. They started digging carefully, inch by inch, using hand tools to avoid collapsing the structure. The deeper they went, the more it looked like a vault, not a mine tunnel. There were steel ribs, electrical conduits, and what looked like a ventilation system buried behind frozen rock. On one wall, a faded stencil read, "Authorized personnel only, level C access." Fred stepped back and stared at it for a long time. Whatever BR9 was, it wasn't supposed to exist on any map. By that night, the entire crew knew they'd crossed a line. They weren't just chasing gold anymore. They were inside a forgotten Cold War installation, sealed for reasons no one wanted to think about. But Fred wasn't turning back. He'd come too far, and he could feel it in his gut. The gold they'd already found was nothing compared to what was waiting behind that collapsed vault door marked BR9. They stood in silence before it, lamps flickering against layers of frost and rust. No one spoke. The air was colder here, heavier, like it hadn't been touched in half a century. Fred ran his gloved hand across the steel, tracing the faded stencil until his breath fogged in front of him. Then he gave a single nod. The hesitation broke. The first hammer strike on the vault door sent a metallic echo that rolled through the tunnels like thunder. Hours of chiseling, cutting, and shoring followed until the ice gave way, revealing a cavity filled with gravel unlike anything the Yukon had ever seen. The walls shimmered under their lamps, fine black sand and quartz veins, streaked with a dull yellow glow. At first, the crew thought it was rich pay dirt, some hidden placer pocket that time had forgotten. But when Fred brushed aside the frost and dug deeper, his shovel hit solid metal. Not a rock, a bar. He lifted it out, and for a moment no one spoke. The gold was clean, rectangular, perfectly smelted, stamped with serial numbers, and an emblem that didn't belong to any mining company. Fred turned it over and saw the engraving. U.S. Reserve, 1955. It wasn't placer gold at all. It was government bullion, stored and abandoned. They started digging faster, unearthing more and more bars from the gravel bed until the chamber floor gleamed under the work lights. Some were buried under clay, others stacked in neat formations like someone had deliberately sealed them there decades ago. By dawn, they had over 40 bars cleaned and logged. Each one weighed 40 pounds, uniform and flawless. The total, nearly $18 million in gold, sat in front of them, silent and heavy, like a secret too big to exist. Fred leaned against the tunnel wall, staring at the pile. All those years chasing bad ground, being mocked on national television, and now he was standing on top of a fortune that could rewrite Yukon history. But instead of celebration, there was unease. None of this made sense. Why would the U.S. government hide gold bars in a glacial mine in the middle of nowhere, and then cover it up under Project Patriot? The questions barely formed before the first drone appeared. A faint hum in the distance, moving slow over the ice. They killed the lights and watched the red glow drift past. Within a day, strangers were spotted on the ridge, men with polarized visors and clean snowmobiles, scanning the terrain. No logos, no names, just watchers. When Fred tried to contact his Dawson supplier, the radio connection cut out midway. Something was intercepting their signal. That night, headlights flashed from the valley. A convoy, black SUVs, and a flatbed marked Heritage Security Group. The lead man stepped out, holding an official document sealed in plastic. He claimed the site had been designated under a Heritage Excavation Clause, giving his company exclusive control of any recovered historical materials. Fred called it what it was: nonsense. But when he read the fine print, his stomach turned. The clause referenced former U.S. federal property lost under classified circumstances. The language was too specific, too recent. Someone knew exactly what he'd found. He took the document back to camp, scanned the QR seal, and traced the corporate registration. It led to a holding firm in Nevada. 2 layers down, the director's name surfaced: a former Discovery producer who'd once filmed with Parker Schnabel during Season 10. That's when Fred understood the leak wasn't random. Someone on the inside had known where he went, what he was after, and had built a legal trap around it before he even broke ground. The story wasn't just out, it was weaponized. Within hours, emails from a Dawson law office began flooding his inbox, warning him of potential violations and environmental breaches. He ignored them. His focus shifted from gold to survival. They had one night to move everything before the site was seized. Orders snapped across camp like rifle shots. The team went into full extraction mode. Every gold bar was cataloged, sealed in heavy polymer, and stacked into insulated crates marked machinery parts. They used winches to drag them up the slope under tarps, while one man monitored the thermal feeds. The medic kept the fire low, the engineer rigged diversion charges at the entrance, and Fred coordinated everything through encrypted comms. They worked without breaks, their breath fogging the freezing air as the wind picked up. The generator hummed softly, echoing against the ice as they loaded the final crate into the hauler. No one spoke. No one dared. They knew what would happen if they were caught. The glacial corridor had become a no-fly zone overnight, unofficial but real. Yet Fred's timing was flawless. At 3:47 a.m., under full whiteout conditions, the convoy rolled out in formation, headlights off, following GPS pings only they could read. Behind them, the tunnels went dark, the vault silent once again. By sunrise, nothing remained. The camp, the scaffolding, the gear, gone. Even the tire tracks vanished beneath fresh snow. Locals who passed through days later swore the glacier looked untouched, as if the entire operation had been swallowed overnight. They found no signs of habitation, no discarded drums, not even footprints, just the faint imprint of steel doors peeking through a thin crust of frost, slowly closing as the ice reclaimed the entrance. In Dawson, whispers began circulating almost immediately. Some said Fred's operation had been raided. Others claimed he'd sold the gold to private collectors through offshore channels. But those who knew him best didn't buy it. They said Fred Lewis had pulled off something no one in Gold Rush history ever had. Mined government gold from a classified Cold War site, outsmarted both the authorities and the network, and vanished before anyone could take it from him. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Every ounce of that 18 million had been real, and every move he made that night had been calculated to protect it. The glacier hadn't swallowed the mine. Fred had erased it. But erasing a mine doesn't erase the gold. It just hides its trail. Weeks later, that trail began to reappear, not in the ground, but in numbers. Quiet ripples started surfacing across the Yukon's financial system. At first, no one noticed. The transactions were too clean, too dispersed, trickling through back channels and rural bank branches that rarely saw movement beyond fuel accounts and placer royalties. But by the third week, auditors flagged something impossible. A cluster of sudden high-value gold deposits from small corporate entities tied to long-dormant mining claims. The strange part wasn't the gold, it was the consistency. Every deposit was standardized in weight, purity, and serial documentation. It was as if someone had unloaded industrial-grade bullion onto the market all at once. The numbers didn't lie. Over $20 million in new gold had entered circulation in less than a month. That shouldn't have been possible in the middle of a frozen mining season. Analysts started tracing the flows, connecting dots between shell accounts, investment trusts, and old claim registries. The deeper they looked, the more one name kept surfacing: Fred Lewis. His old investors, thought to have walked away years ago, were suddenly flush with quiet capital. One anonymous whistleblower came forward to the Yukon Mining Board, claiming Fred had outsmarted Discovery and the government at once. He hadn't stolen gold. He'd legalized it. When investigators dug into public archives, they found a filing that dated back to 1911, an original claim registration under the name Freedom Creek Mining Company. The paperwork had never been officially closed, and its coordinates overlapped almost perfectly with the section of the glacial corridor where Fred's operation had taken place. Somewhere in those dusty legal codes, Fred had found the flaw. Under Yukon mining law, any discovered material within an active historic claim could be filed as new recovery, no matter how long it had been dormant. Fred had transferred ownership quietly, using the descendants of the original claim holders as signatories, cutting them a fraction of the value. By the time anyone realized what he'd done, the loophole had already legitimized the entire haul. Every ounce of gold from Bravo 9 had been logged through a legal mining registry over a century old. The government couldn't seize it, Discovery couldn't claim rights to it, and the courts couldn't challenge it without unraveling half of Yukon's mining framework. The total value came in at just over $100 million, and Fred Lewis owned every last dollar. When the news hit Dawson, the reaction was split straight down the middle. Some called it fraud, others called it genius. But one thing was certain: Fred had beaten them all. He reappeared in town 2 months later, looking nothing like the beaten-down miner from the previous year. The beard was gone, the fatigues replaced with a clean jacket embroidered with a new logo: Freedom Mining. His truck was spotless, custom-built, its bed modified for high-security transport. Cameras followed him down Front Street as reporters shouted questions, but this time Fred didn't hide. He parked in front of the assessor's office, stepped out, and handed over a folder full of documentation: assay sheets, tax filings, and full audit reports from an independent lab in Fairbanks. He didn't need Discovery's cameras anymore. He had his own crew, his own narrative, his own empire. In the footage that later surfaced online, Fred stood beside his truck and said only one thing: "Every ounce is accounted for." It wasn't defiance, it was finality. The man who had been branded the weakest link in Gold Rush had just rewritten the playbook. By week's end, every miner in the Yukon was talking. Tony Beets, known for never giving praise, admitted in an interview, "That's the biggest win I've ever seen from Lewis. He found something none of us could have." Even Parker, tight-lipped as ever, dodged questions about it, though sources said he tried to buy into one of Fred's new partnerships. The transformation was complete. Fred Lewis, the underdog, the outcast, had become a legend. Not because of what he found, but because of how he found it. He'd used discipline, secrecy, and strategy instead of brute force. The Yukon had seen a lot of gold miners, but never one who played the game like a soldier. The strange part was, even with his newfound success, Fred never boasted. He refused interviews, turned down offers, and when Discovery proposed a full redemption season to chronicle his comeback, he declined outright. "Some things," he told an associate, "aren't meant for television." Then came the final twist. Weeks later, an off-record journalist met Fred for what was supposed to be a routine piece on post-claim cleanups. Over coffee, Fred let something slip, something the journalist barely believed at first. BR9 wasn't the only one, he said quietly. There were others. 8 more, maybe 9, buried deeper than we ever reached. The journalist pressed for details, but Fred wouldn't elaborate. He just smiled and said, "We barely touched the surface." That line spread like wildfire. Satellite analysts began re-examining glacial imagery from the Tintina corridor. Within days, they found what Fred had hinted at: faint, symmetrical anomalies beneath the ice, perfectly aligned along a fault line stretching nearly 6 miles. Thermal readings showed colder pockets surrounded by dense metallic reflections, too uniform to be natural. The data suggested there were multiple vaults sealed under the glacier shelf, some possibly connected by reinforced tunnels. Experts tried to make sense of it. Some said they were Cold War fuel depots. Others believed they were part of an abandoned Continental Reserve program, a backup to Fort Knox in case of nuclear conflict. But the patterns matched the internal design of Bravo 9 too closely to be coincidence. The mining board launched an official inquiry, though no one could legally excavate without Fred's cooperation, and he wasn't responding. Then he disappeared again. Not the kind of disappearance you plan. He left his offices empty, trucks gone, permits revoked. Freedom Mining's registration was quietly dissolved. The only clue was a single email sent from an encrypted account to a former crew member, heading back north. Same coordinates. Don't follow. In the months that followed, local pilots began reporting faint signal interference near the corridor again. One claimed to see lights moving under the ice at night. Another said he spotted a fresh cut in the glacier leading toward an uncharted ridge. When authorities checked, the markings had already refrozen, erasing any sign of passage. The Yukon grew quiet again, the kind of silence that settles before something larger surfaces. But those who'd worked with Fred knew what that meant. He wasn't running. He was continuing. Somewhere beneath the frozen ground, far past the buried vaults of Bravo 9, the real story was still unfolding. An operation larger than gold, larger than television, and far beyond the reach of anyone who tried to stop it. Fred Lewis had started as a man chasing redemption. Now he was chasing something far older and far more valuable than anyone dared imagine.